Do we hit?
Almost ready.
Okay, all right.
Almost ready. Oh. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Brian Pitts. I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Brazilian Studies. We have also with us today Professor Susanna Hecht, who is the Director of the Center for Brazilian Studies here at UCLA. And we would like to invite you to today's talk by Professor Rafael Llores from Emergence to Self-Doubt, Brazil's Place in a World in Crisis. I've actually known Rafael for many years. We are both fellow historians of Brazil. And I met him about 10 years ago when I was still a 10, 12 years ago when I was still a graduate student. He um, and he had just finished his PhD, I think not that long before. He did his PhD in Latin American history at Emory University. But he is a professor of Latin American history and politics today at the University of Denver, and has written a variety of books, book chapters, and lots of articles in both Brazilian and international periodicals. So he's not only a scholar, but also an expert on Brazilian politics in the wider media. His research interests include Brazilian and Latin American development process, Brazilian foreign policy, and Brazil-U.S. relations. His first book which was titled "Transforming Brazil," and I'm forgetting the subtitle, even though I've read the book before. Um, what is it, Rafael? The rest of it?
A good question. I think it's a history of national development in the post-war era. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. And but he's also written a lot on like I said on Brazil-U.S. relations. We've actually co-authored several pieces together on the role that the United States played in Brazil's long coup process between the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the election of Jair Bolsonaro several years ago. And he'll be talking about that in part today. Um, his books and articles include things like Qual Desenvolvimento, Os Debates, Sentidos e Lições da Era Desenvolvimentista, and Culturas em Choque, a Globalização e os Desafios para a Convivência Multicultural. He's also co-authored and co-edited several edited volumes, including one that's very relevant to our interest here in the Center for Brazilian Studies, Frontiers of Development in the Amazon, Riches, Risks, and Resistances. And so today he's going to, not to give us talk for him, but he's going to give us sort of a historical background of what led us to this point in Brazilian politics today, and talk also about like what we could expect going forward as Lula's third term comes near to an end. There's not a really clear plan, I think, on the right or left as to what might come next. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Rafael.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, Professor Susanna Heck, and the Center for Brazilian Studies at the UCLA. What a wonderful invitation and a wonderful opportunity to share some ideas with such a qualified group of people that are, I can't see the participants, but I'm sure hopefully are logging in, scholars and experts on Brazil. So in addition to thank for the opportunity, I just want to say that I think it's absolutely relevant to be reflecting about this moment in Brazil and in the world, kind of Brazil in the world. And I've been writing just a kind of a tentative op-ed piece to hopefully publish soon. The idea that the current multilateral crisis, right, or crisis of multilateralism ongoing, which already happened before Trump's ascension to power, but I think, of course, escalated now more recently under Trump, is I think particularly challenging for middle range, middle power countries such as Brazil. But I think then looking at the case of Brazil, we may think about situation of other countries in especially in key players in what perhaps today we could call the global south. So hopefully the talk will also be illuminating, hopefully, and of course, this is an invitation for a discussion later with, again, qualified participants here of what's next, right? The what's next is always a little bit prospective, and I'm even though I pay close attention to some of these things, of course, I'm also asking and speculating a little bit of things. So that's the first kind of invitation slash disclaimer I wanted to say. And then secondly, to say that if you would please indulge me as a historian, social scientist, that I will do a little bit of a quick historical perspective to come to the situation of today, especially insofar as this idea of Brazil's challenges within a multilateralism in crisis of today. So that's kind of how I wanted to frame things, and again, also apologize in advance because some of these things, of course, to some of the experts here in the room will be a little simplistic and obvious, but I just want to make sure if you are on the same page. So, Brian, if I can just kind of open up things here, I don't know if I can share. Let's see. How do I do this?
Yeah, you have the ability to share your screen.
Yeah. You did? Is that it? Oh, hold on. There. Okay. So share. That it is. Sharing. Okay. So here we go. Are you guys seeing the Christ? Okay. So here we go. There you go. Great. Okay. So this is the slide for some of those general notes, saying how they're going to frame the conversation and continue from on. As I said, just to situate things, right? The relevance of Brazil, I think, goes even beyond Latin America, as I mentioned before, as an important player for different reasons, right? In this situation of the global south today, and of course in Latin America, just to remember, it is the largest country in terms of territorial territory, in terms of the economy and the population. So it's one of those few countries in the world that is in the top 5 of population and size, right? The geography and territory, and then of course the top. It varies, right? Some people mention Brazil as top, the 10th largest economy or the 8th largest economy, and in terms of purchasing power, now some people, I've seen some rankings of Brazil as arguably perhaps even the 6th economy in the world today. So those things, vary a little bit. The point is that, of course, it's an important country, of course, filled with potential, but also challenges that I want to just kind of remind us a little bit now. And uniquely so, of course, we speak this beautiful language, Portuguese, which, again, many of you here speak as well and know that. So Brazil has this long history of being this country in Latin America and even beyond Latin America, but historically more as an important player in Latin America that has a long, in different moments, right, has been seen as appealing or attracting attention for being a country with tremendous potential and a country that sought to project a positive and appealing image in its foreign policy. That didn't start today, didn't start under Lula, it started a long time ago. So this idea, this project, goes to a sense, goes all the way back to the 19th century of trying to present itself as an emerging country, as an emerging economy, as an emerging player regionally in South America, then more later in Latin America, and more recently even beyond the region. So projecting that, and to some extent being able to sustain that positive, appealing image of, again, here as the country of the future, the land of the future, right? A label, a slogan that was not coined by Brazilians, but Brazilians owned it and ran with that whole idea. This appealing image of the potential of Brazil went beyond its beautiful nature and its, of course, potential in terms of size and territory and natural resources, but also because of political projects that in different moments the Brazilian leadership, economic, intellectual, political leadership managed to put together, to implement, that attracted attention in the world, to a large extent to the United States, of course, the country historically hegemonically player in the hemisphere. So already in the 1930s, as we see here, FDR visiting Brazil, seeing Brazil as a vital country in the region. That extended into this moment. Here we have Brazil in the time, the Brazilian president Kubitschek in the Time magazine, the guy who built Brasilia, as you can see the image there. So this is a moment of fast-paced industrialization. This is a moment of kind of deepening, to some extent, one of the most unprecedented moments of a vibrant democratic institutions functioning in the country, that attracted attention to Brazil too, as a country that is industrializing, is growing its economy, it's projecting itself in the world, but also as a democracy, right? This was a very important moment for this sense of the rise of Brazil, also intellectually, culturally, artistically, architectonically, and those things. Interestingly, but to different reasons, now under dictatorial regime in the 70s also attracted interest of big players in the world, especially the United States. So here we have Nixon and the Brazilian dictator of the time in the early 70s. Ernesto Medici, the guy who projected to build this huge trans-Amazonic highway, as you can see there, right? And the guy who's the president under what's called this Brazilian economic miracle, right? Gladly, the Trans-Amazonia was not entirely, very minimally implemented, and an economic miracle, of course, proved to be a bubble. But nonetheless, at the time, it was seen as this important, emerging, potentially important player in the world. Of course, that experience was always mired by this continuing, which of course speaks to the situation of Brazil today. So from the historical perspective, this continued a path of deep structural economic and beyond economic, right, inequality. As we can see here, the traditional images of Brazil, I believe in the late 70s, was this idea of Belindia, right? Brazil that had inside itself, economic living standards of Belgium, but also of India at the time. At the time, again, India, not the India of today. So that also was always a structural limitation, a structural feature, right, that marred a little bit this perception of Brazil too. In addition to that, Brazil, the recent political history of Brazil was also mired in political struggles. We have here with us Brian Pitts, who is an expert on this period, the dictatorship and the transition from the dictatorship in Brazil, right? So at the moment when Brazil seemed to be emerging in the country for deepening, right, its path of or attempting to deepen its path of socioeconomic political inclusion, which was the late 50s, early 70s, the idea that the country required structural changes, structural reforms, as the picture here on the left displays, that promise was curtailed, right? The democratic life of Brazil was truncated by the coup of 1964, right? That emerged the country, placed the country in this long dictatorial regime that led to a multidimensional mobilization from civil society, from workers, as we see here, the rise of the emergence of Lula as a union leader, and later on the picture on the top right there of the movement to demand the right to vote, diretas já in the early 70s. So the country, of course, was this long period of repression, right? Brazil, just the movie I'm Still Here, right? Just was on the Oscar right there in LA as the best foreign picture. So it portrays very well the challenge of life under the dictatorial regime in Brazil. But society organized itself, the political leadership and civil society and workers and so forth, and students, and the country transitioned to democracy. But even as that democratic life was being rebuilt, and it was rebuilt in an even richer, more multidimensional, sophisticated, I guess, or at least a more complex demand and agenda for change, not only hearkening back to the moment of increased labor mobilization and increased economic political life of civil society as in the late 50s. Now the agenda was even more complex and richer, right, of Afro-Brazilians mobilizing for inclusion, indigenous Brazilians mobilizing for inclusion, environmental rights, feminist movements. That led to what we have to do. It's still in Brazil, even though much attacked since, right, the very progressive constitution of the 1988. So it was this promise again that Brazil is transitioning, and Brazil is happening once again. Unfortunately, right, harkening back to this back and forth, path of Brazilian the political, economic, social development, the country, even after the tragic years of the 1980s in terms of the debt crisis and the hyperinflation and deepening inequality that happened there. Even when the process of stabilization of the economy, there's different plans as we see here, right, and attempts to curb the hyperinflation of the 80s and late 80s into the 90s, right? Even when we have democratic life, the country continued to face this structural, not only inequality, but structural economic challenges to kind of put the economy on a path of sustainable growth. So in a way, and I want to put this idea for the conversation here with the colleagues in the room, from the 60s, from the 50s, we had 60s and 70s and 80s and all the way to the 90s, this continued attempt to address things that were curtailed, that should and could have been addressed earlier, had not, right, the derailment of democratic life taking place. And in a way, all of that to say that Lula built, right, on a series of attempts to address challenges on the economic growth and let alone economic inequality, but also on this idea of projecting the country abroad by appealing to its image, to its projecting a positive image of the country. So that's how we get to the early 2000s, and we're getting closer to to the more, what I wanted to talk about today with Lula's Brazil. Of course, Lula now on his third term, as Brian phrased, right? So all in all, right, even though I am acknowledging, of course, that Lula did not invent the wheel, right? He didn't start from scratch, but he really managed to put together a new coalition in power and forces and his structural changes from economic policies to affirmative action policies to new diplomatic, assertive, and creative policies, building again on some previous ones, but nonetheless synergically catalyzing previous attempts. So that led to this idea, this sense in the early 2000s, as we see here, that Brazil is taking off, even acknowledged by The Economist magazine. Brazil was trying to find this balance of having good relations, as we see here, Lula with Bush and with Obama, good relations, continued relations with this traditional economic and most important, partner, historically also diplomatic partner from the beginning of the 20th century, but also reaching out to other important players in the world. As we see here, the visits of 2000, I think 3 or 4, Lula's visit to China, right? And much of this, of course, continues to today, and that's where we're going to come back to this. Brazil is building on these different things, and it's projecting now more successfully and more assertively this idea, not only as an emergent as an important player regionally, but as an emergent player of a global reach, if not a global player, an emergent player of global reach, and is strengthening this path that didn't start with Lula, but I think was confirmed, consolidated under Lula, of trying to have a multilateral and a global, right, perspective on its diplomatic efforts. So this global projection, as we see here in the G20 on the lower right picture here, Lula participating of a G20 in 2008, was confirmed by even new, not only the traditional multilateral institutions, but new initiatives, right? That it's hard, the label is always a little complicated, but should we call the BRICS a multilateral organization or not? Because, of course, it doesn't fit the traditional idea of multilateralism, such as the United Nations. But since this is a world in the 21st century where new organizations are put together by groups of countries, again, such as G20, as we go back here, right, in the bottom right here. Now, of course, BRICS became a very important new venue for Brazil to project to articulate, right, its interest with other players beyond just bilateral relations and actors of institutional multilateral organizations such as the World a trade organization, which of course now is much battered and in crisis. So the BRICS, which was created in 2010 in Brasilia, here we have Lula, was extended, and we get closer a little bit to what happened in Brazil after Lula, the first Lula 1 and 2, right, which is the government of Dilma, which again mobilized Brazil diplomatic efforts through traditional players, again, continue to have good relations, a little challenges under Obama, but nonetheless, traditional relations with the United States, European Union, but also now again with China and the BRICS. So, but all of this, as we all know here, right, participants of this conversation, much of that kind of unraveled rapidly in the second decade of the 21st century, is when Brazil started facing important economic challenges. Is kind of when the 2008-2009 global, economic housing crisis of the United States that impacted the global economy really trickled down or percolated and impacted more fully Brazil because of the lower prices of commodity exports of Brazilian economy. And then also, on the other hand, associated with this, but not only, it's not necessarily a causal relationship, it's kind of in tandem, though it has connections to that, right? A new political crisis that emerged in Brazil, starting maybe before, but coming really to a fore in 2013, as we have here one image of a mobilization in 2013, which started, right, as students mobilizing for what I would call more democracy, mobilizing for more grassroots, right to have a participation in the political process. A country that had done so well economically in the first decade of the century, 21st century, now seeking to also exert and have a broader saying on things, and also, already expressing some of the rising economic challenges that people were starting to feel in the country. So that translated in 2013 because Brazil was hosting the 2014 World soccer cup of a very sad memory for us with the 7-1 against Germany, of course. So that mobilization, anti-Copa mobilization, we want a FIFA-style hospitals. We questioning the expenditures of the stadiums, which indeed was a huge tab on the demands by FIFA to build stadiums. That, of course, continued to polarize society. That mobilization was quickly, I would say, use a strong verb here, hijacked, right, by anti-establishment, anti-left, right is leading all the way to the extreme right mobilization against, right, the establishment, which now had become the Workers' Party, right? The Workers' Party had now become the establishment. So that led us into a very polarized election here, the election that Dilma managed to be reelected, but as you can see here, very close election, right, against the Aécio Neves in 2014. Aécio Neves and his party and a coalition of other right-wing parties mobilized to reject, not accepting the electoral results. I think you may have heard that before, right? And they got together to start pushing for, right, the impeachment drive. This idea in 2015, I've been to Brazil often in that year, and I saw some posters, around the cities demanding people to show up on the following Sunday to say that if we don't go to the streets, she stays, right? Se não formos para a rua, ela fica, which is an overtly, of course, deeply questionable path of mobilization to a crime that was a push to demand impeachment, but in search of a crime, right? It was an idea already. They had to remove Dilma from power, but that, of course, mobilized for in search of a crime, which again, of course, was put together by this already discrediting of the establishment of the political system, which is, of course, Lava Jato. And we have here the image of Sérgio Moro, right, the national hero of the time. To some, not as much, but to some, sectors in Brazilian society, is still a national hero. All in all, we led to Brazil was facing, again, as many other liberal democracies around the world, this growing ideological, political polarization based on these anti-establishment feelings and ideas that translated again in Brazil in the impeachment or the parliamentarian coup, and then now the sense that Brazil, of course, blew it, as we can see here in the Economist magazine. Not to say that the Economist has the final say in what's going on in Brazil, but it reflects, right, this image of Brazil at the time. That, of course, led the country into this challenging moment of what, Temer interregnum, right, of this Temer transition to what finally came later in 2018 with the election of Bolsonaro. So the image here on the right, top left actually, is the cabinet ministry of under Temer, the guy in the center there, right, which resembles, the cabinet of some of the dictatorial cabinet, presidents, which is, of course, this old man in power again. But just to reflect that the Temer represented not only the traditional establishment, right wing and right, and then some partners, extreme right wing, what I would say Thermidorian, right, or restoration, ideas of some of the changes that were taking place in Brazil at the time. That the government was in 2016 all the way to the election of 2018. 2018, Lula here, just before his arrest, right, in the mid-year 2018, where he meets his old, former workers in the labor union of São Bernardo, before he goes to be in the federal police in Curitiba for a year and a half, right? And of course, that culminates into the election of Bolsonaro, this lovely gentleman here on the right, pointing fingers as a gun, which was the kind of the slogan of his campaign in 2018. Bolsonaro represented, kind of an interesting new chapter in this whole path, right? An exceptional path of straight jacket, right? Straight alignment with the United States government, with the United States foreign policy, the United States position globally. I mean, just look at Bolsonaro's pronouncements at the United Nations National Assembly meetings, right? Which absolutely align with the ones that Trump was proclaiming at that time. So all of this Bolsonaro was taking cues and tried to challenge some of this multilateral approach of diplomacy that Lula really harnessed and consolidated. And he was also taking cues from the Trump administration in terms of its denialism of science and the COVID tragedy that not only happened in Brazil, in the United States, but also happened in Brazil. Trump was also taking cues from the Trump administration insofar as how to deal with democracy, right? The attempt, the not lack of recognition of the electoral results in 2020 by the Trump supporters, led by Trump, led to the Capitol invasion in 2021, and in Brazil it led to January. In Brazil it was to January 8th, in the United States January 6th, right? January 8th invasion of not only the Capitol but of presidential palace and the Supreme Court, because they are on the same square in Brasilia. Those who have been to Brasilia actually know it's a very interesting architecturally, right, place, square, and they invaded all of those institutions. This idea of not accepting the results, which means deepen and exploded, right, this anti-democratic and polarized situation that Brazil still faces today. Nonetheless, Lula, in this broad coalition, broad front, right, managed to be elected. In Brazil, you may run, right, for election again. You just have to step down after 2 terms. So he brought as his vice president, who is the current vice president of Brazil, right, the guy who ran against him in 2006, Alckmin. Geraldo Alckmin, who's there right there on his Lula's left side there, after the election. So with this broad coalition, broad front, they managed to prevent Bolsonaro's re-election, even though it was a very close election. Again, reflecting the continued polarization and the continued power of the extreme right, the anti-establishment of the neo-fascist, the pro-military sector, right, that Bolsonaro catalyzed and represented still in Brazilian society. As this coming back president, Lula has been trying to revive this global projection of Brazil in the world. Even before he took office, he went to a COP in Egypt, right, in Cairo, as an invited special guest to talk about Brazil's new place and try to revive protection for the Amazon and revive plans, environmental tragedy that was unfolded in Brazil under Bolsonaro. So he tried to harness, right, and harken back to some of the successes of the early 2000s. Then visited Biden, right, to defend democracy. They have this very kind of vague but pronouncement in defense of democracy. I think it was 3 months after he took office in power. He had visited Argentina in a CELAC meeting. CELAC, this regional organization of South American countries outside of the Organization of American States, an interesting organization. And then Lula also more recently hosted the G20 meeting in Brazil. So he's been working on those things. But and that's my main point here, right? He faces a much more challenging domestic and international context to be able to do this. Of course, the wheels of history keep moving, so it's impossible to repeat history. And I'm not saying he's trying to repeat, literally the policies of the early 2000s, economic, diplomatic, but he's trying to kind of come back to the essence of some of those approaches, but in a much more challenging domestic international context. Lula domestically is a much less he was never consensual, but he's a much less able and it's a politician that is facing a much deeper level of polarization. So his support has continued to be much constrained to a specific of people that voted for him. He hasn't been able to reach beyond that with some limitations. So he faces a much more challenging political scenario. He faces a much more challenging economic scenario. There are being huge economic constraints in Brazil due to the crisis in the global economy. The global economy of today is not the global economy of the early 2000s. He faces legal constraints in terms of social expenditures that were put together by the Temer administration, right, in 2016 and 17. He faces very huge deficits that were, expenditures that Bolsonaro made as president, and of course for his attempt to be reelected in 2022. And again, just politically also impacting the idea of what can be done in terms of social expenditures. So the policies of the economic policies of the current government in Brazil, economic and tied to it, of course, social policies, social expenditures are tied to this pacote fiscal, to this idea that we need to balance the budget, which I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad idea, but that has constrained, right, the possibility to expand some of the social policies. Some has been taking place. He has increased a little bit expenditures on Bolsa Familia, on Minha Casa Minha Vida, but much less so in terms of the minimum wage, which later studies by IPEA have proven to have demonstrated that not only Bolsa Familia, but the increase in the minimum wage actually was one of the key reasons for the lower of inequality, or bringing from absolute poverty 35 million Brazilians in the late by the end of his administration in 2009, 2010. So it's much more constrained situation here. Haddad, this powerful finance minister of Brazil, of course, much criticized, including sometimes by myself, in the sense, could he been doing more or no in terms of social expenditures? He faces tremendous challenges also in passing things through Congress, for different reasons. The Congress in Brazil, as you can see here, is extremely fragmented, right, in terms of too many parties. Parties that, of course, has to ad hoc negotiate all the time. Some of these parties are willing to negotiate, of course, some parties for rent, as we call it there in Brazil, right? So, but of course, the cost for approving things that Lula wants to approve in Congress are very high in terms of what concessions he needs to give. Bolsonaro also kind of reverse of what Trump is doing, right? Abdicated presidential powers to Congress. So the Congress, not only legally, but in terms of how politics is playing out on a daily basis, is much more assertive and much more able to halt, plans that Lula wants to have passed in Congress. So that he faces also structurally these political challenges in the country as a whole. The country, it's not necessarily a challenge for Lula, but it reflects the current political situation of Brazil. We have seen this kind of the reverse of Sergio Moro, right? This judicial activism, but by the Supreme Court now, and trying to restore a little bit normalcy, right, in the judicial and the legal system in Brazil. We have this not only, but this prominent justice of the Supreme Court in Brazil, Moraes, here on the left is kind of this imposing image there, right? Who has leading the investigations and the trials against the attempt coup in January 8th of 2023, and also in a different path, other legal cases have made Bolsonaro ineligible. So different from the United States, where Trump remained eligible, right? That culminated in his return to power now more recently. In Brazil, currently, as of now, Bolsonaro is not eligible to be elected to come back to power, though that has been the plan, right, by him and his family and his supporters. So that's the situation we have now. So as I said before, and trying to take us back to some of the conversation here. Let me see my time here. I think we're in a good time here to have a conversation. So Brazil has this attempt of broadening its economic partners, broadening its diplomatic partners. Brazil has, from the 60s through the 70s, even beyond, but clearly, as I tried to make the case, under Lula in the 2000s, projecting this image of a regional player of global reach, and articulating its diplomatic efforts, its presence in the world economically, politically, diplomatically, environmentally, geopolitically, through existing multilateral structures, such as, important cases that Brazil has filed in the early 2000s against the United States protectionist, right, policies, European Union protectionist policies, right, in the World Trade Organization. That whole kind of established multilateral frame has faced new challenges more recently. So Brazil, along with other countries, especially in the global South, but not only, has developed new strategies and new initiatives and new ways and new challenges. Again, the G20, which of course includes the United States, but the BRICS, which does not, right? Ways to continue to have this image of an important player that has something to say and wants to have a say, right, in not as big geopolitical or military disputes in the world, though Lula has made pronouncements about the Ukraine war, which didn't go very well. We can come back to it if you guys want, to the situation in Gaza. But certainly in some key areas that Brazil is highly respected in the world, environmental policies, but also in terms of raising new issues to the international agenda, such as issues of poverty, issues of hunger, right? Issues of the inequality of treatment to the global South countries within the multilateral structures put in place after World War II. So Lula has been trying to do all these things. But again, beyond the domestic challenges, he faces a much more challenging international context of today. Of course, we are in the middle of, there's no consensus if it's a new Cold War or not, if it's an overt hegemonic dispute for power. What does that entail to the traditional areas of presence of the United States, such as Latin America, such as where Brazil is, right? But there is this growing dispute between economic and into other areas, dispute between the United States and China, two key countries, right? China is the most important economic partner of Brazil since 2009. and the United States is the second as a country. So how to balance these two players, right? How to be in the middle of this situation. That's what presents a new challenge for Brazil. Interestingly, in some key exports, right, from Brazil and from the United States, China is the main consumer, right? Such as soybean and meat. So how to if you're competing with the United States for the Chinese market, how can you be in the situation where you want to have good relations with both? These challenges are not only because of the new Trump administration. Some of the challenges have been put together by these rising disputes between rivalry disputes, hegemonic disputes for influence over Latin America already in place under the Biden administration, if not before, even under Obama. But of course, Trump, with his whole new tariffs and questioning of how the United States has allegedly being mistreated by the multilateral agencies of the world, right? Playing much harder ball and challenging this channels of dialogue and these channels for mobilization and projection of Brazilian presence in the world more recently. Brazil has been making this case, right? Amorim has said, and others, and Lula overtly, that BRICS and Brazil is not anti-West. It just wants to have a say in the world and wants to be respected as such, and to be able to have partners that go beyond being under any one specific hegemonic rule, be it the United States or China. But of course, it's a growing, challenging situation that Brazil faces, Brazil and other countries in the world face today. BRICS, of course, has been an important channel and venue for these things. Brazil is hosting the upcoming in July conference of the BRICS. So Lula will be the host and will try to articulate that BRICS has a BRICS Plus now, right? BRICS is a much more extended organization today with many other countries. Brazil is a founding country, of course, and Brazil wants to continue to have an important say within BRICS and to project BRICS, as I said here before, right? As I didn't say, as a quote here, the Brazilian ambassador, not as anti-West. Why is this important? When in the conference in 2000, wasn't last year, 2023, they expanded BRICS Plus, the U.S. media portrayed BRICS as an anti-West, right, organization. China was said to be the one that invited Iran, invited other countries to join, and Brazil and India tried to veto or not. There's some debates about that. But the point is that Lula, within that conversation, trying to make the case that it's not anti-West, should not be seen as anti-West. Don't make it into a anti-West or Western organization, whatever West is, if it is in crisis or not. We could and maybe should discuss here today. So Brazil is articulating through the BRICS. Brazil is articulating through the CELAC again. CELAC met a couple of weeks ago where Lula made an important pronouncement there and argue that CELAC needs to act together because unity, right? União faz a força. They need to be united to resist the new crisis of multilateralism and the new pressures, tariff, but not only geopolitical pressure from the United States in the hemisphere. Continues to articulate its good relations with China. Lula is in China today. Interestingly, just out of coming from Russia, which was a more controversial visit, but is in China today, right, with a big delegation, and wants to continue to deepen its economic, but beyond, right, relations with China, which goes beyond now being a market for its commodity exports, but also now an important player in providing funds to finance economic projects in Brazil. So China is playing this double role here in doing these things. Will Brazil be able to manage this? Will be able to stay the course? Of course, we don't know. It's a challenging scenario, as I tried to make the case. Much will depend on two key things: how Trump will react to some of these things. So I may go here, right? How Trump will react. Maybe go back to this one. Trump pointing the fingers there, right? How Trump will react on this. But also it will depend if the policies that Lula is trying to put in place now, economic, diplomatic, and so forth, will continue, which brings us to the situation, again, to the domestic context, right? Bolsonaro continues to be not eligible to run, though there continues to be attempts to provide a general amnesty, right? Even though he's ineligible for electoral crimes, not for the attempted coup, but the trial of the attempted coup is in the Supreme Court now. It's going to be a long trial, maybe up to the end of the year. But there's this growing mobilization in society, not as big anymore as a couple of years ago, or last year, but in Congress, right, to try to provide an amnesty to all crimes, and it perhaps could entail making Bolsonaro eligible again. But in the absence of Bolsonaro, the extreme right potentially has a few other names, not a consensual name, but here we have on the side of Bolsonaro, the current governor of the state of São Paulo, the most powerful state in the country, a governor that is doing in terms of approval, right, is doing fine, has higher approvals than Lula. We can get into that, the conservative views or whatever views of the São Paulo electorate vis-a-vis other parts of the country. But the point is that the extreme right will try, right, run for the next election, maybe with a new candidate. So much of what will happen next will depend also on what happens to Brazil. So what are the prospects in a general sense? And again, invitation to share, to have a dialogue with you here in a second. Brazil continues to be reaching out to China. Brazilian diplomats, Lula continues to try to project its image of a global player through BRICS, other channels, but as he did in the image that I presented before, hugging Bush, right? Not alienating, not at the cost of antagonizing the gringos, not necessarily. Though Lula has made some strong pronouncements about Trump's tariffs, new tariffs, right? That is wrong. That's not the path that to lead to prosperity, because of course, again, the what Brazil managed to do, in the early 2000s required that the global economy was more framed along less commercial wars, right, between countries, and lower tariffs on more global open economy. Also will depend, to finish, on whether or not the United States government, the Trump administration, finds a way to have good relations or functional relations with China. Today, they announced that they're revisiting some of the tariffs. All of that to say, I'm not sure it's the more likely scenario, but there's a possible scenario, right, that the United States and China, and perhaps Russia, again, that has a lot to do with the whole situation in Ukraine, but there are some new developments there towards a ceasefire, towards a peace agreement or not. The case is that some speculate that the Trump diplomacy harkens back to this idea of spheres of influence. Split the country into regions where some key superpowers will determine the destiny of that region. Of course, that Latin America traditionally would be the one under the United States, and China, rather than continue to be then a partner to counterbalance the weight of the United States in Latin America and in Brazil, could agree to, as a big player, to kind of split, right, the world. Again, I'm not sure this is a more likely scenario, but it's a possible scenario. Depends on many other things, right? This negotiation between big players that will make Brazil's path, diplomatic path, and projection in the world, and to other key countries in the global south, including Latin America, I would say countries like Mexico and others, right? Much harder to be able to navigate this challenging crisis of multilateralism that we have in the world today. So I hope that provided some key elements for a conversation that I'm very much eager to have with you now. So all of that to say then that I appreciate once again the opportunity, and let's see what you guys would like to continue talking, some questions, comments, so please.
Great, thank you so much, Rafael. That was very comprehensive and very insightful as well. So for the audience, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function below, and we have the chat turned off, but the Q&A function is available. But perhaps we can get our first question from Susanna, and then open it up for the audience after we've had a chance to discuss among ourselves a little bit.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm unmuted, right? Yes, thank you so much for this extraordinary, I don't want to say romp through history in a sort of light way, but a very insightful integration of recent history and its politics. One of the things that I think is going to be quite important in the coming months is the question of the COP30. Of course, it's going to be central in a lot of the geopolitics. But another thing is the whole dynamics now of what you might want to predict, that given the demand for Amazonian products that China embraces, given the tariff barriers to the United States, what you might want to predict about or speculate on about what you think might occur in terms of the national politics via things like the Banca Ruralista, which is very agribusiness oriented, and also the larger dynamics of global demand, deforestation, and the transformation of the Amazon right before this big climate deal.
Sure. Should I?
Yeah, why don't you start there?
Wonderful. No, thank you so much. Thank you so much for two reasons, because it allows us to get into key things. And of course, I didn't mention COP before. So I stand corrected here in the sense of the relevance of the upcoming conference. Interesting. So just by listening to you, many ideas coming up. I would say that the COP, of course, is not happening in an ideal situation, right? This is not a good moment for an environmental cause. I am very concerned. Leading up to the election of Trump, I said, in addition to many other people, in the front line, I think the environmental agenda is on the front line, right? In the United States, of course, but also globally. And that leads to a situation that, sadly, I think catalyzes in its own dynamics, in the sense that if the United States lowers the relevance of environmental issues, other countries, it's kind of a race to the bottom, right? Other countries will do the same. I would say, interestingly, to kind of make the counter argument, that were this happening, I don't know, 10 or maybe even 5 years ago, right? Where China was not becoming such an important player in renewable energy, in electric cars and solar panel, right? That perhaps both countries coming to Belém would be lowering the standards, right, and pressuring for kind of undermining the what I think, even though Lula himself has been contradictory in some things about exploiting oil in the Amazon. So Lula, of course, has navigating this in a complex way as well. But I would say both countries maybe would pressure for lowering the standards, right, and the outcome would be even worse. Then now getting to the actual speculation and maybe hopeful and wishful thinking that maybe the Chinese delegation would be a supporter, right? Because it has competitive edge in renewable energy. That perhaps a counter argument to Trump's lower standards and a possible diplomatic delegation. I would be very surprised if Trump were to go to Belém, but diplomatic delegation to actually, question, slow down, sabotage some of the demands that would hopefully come out of the COP30. Of course, the United States just walked away again from the Paris Accord. So maybe, hopefully, China would kind of present a counter argument that perhaps could be selective in some key areas, not in all areas. But since Lula is in China, but Trump is going to the Middle East now, right? So other delegations, such as some of the oil exporting countries, are likely, right, are going to be very aligned with the United States, and so I think it will be sadly a challenging COP to Brazilian diplomats to be able to navigate, to be able to come with some sort of final resolution agreement, which likely will be very minimalistic. Not what really we would need and would like to have in today's world. And it might require, right, the Brazilian propositions and the agenda to the COP, which has been also negotiated in a complex way within Brazil, right? Again, Bancada Ruralista being a key player there. Not overtly, I would say, in terms of what the Trump administration stands for, but of course it's not an environmental ally for the needs of the Amazon and the expansion of agricultural frontier in the Amazon, as you so well has taught us to learn. So I would say it's a challenging COP. That maybe will require even more mobilization of civil society actors, indigenous groups, environmental groups from Brazil and from abroad. So coalition mobilization of those actors, which does exist, which is happening and will be represented there for sure, to be able to do a parallel COP and to pressure. But again, in terms of a formal diplomatic agreements to be able, especially binding ones, it's a very, very disheartening situation. Please, I'd love to hear you on that.
Well, I kind of agree with you, but one of the things that I always feel about Amazonia is you can always be surprised. There's always the pulo de onça. You think, oh, it's going to be like this, and then there's a big veer.
Yeah.
And civil society in Brazil has proved in many moments to be remarkably strong and generous in its approach to the future. So we'll see. It's a very tenuous moment, and the contradictions of what's going on. And the reality is that China's the new hegemon in Latin America. So the questions about going back to 1823 seem a little dubious, and the Monroe Doctrine.
Is it dead or is it very much alive, right? As the current and previous administrations have stated, it's yeah.
Yeah, well, it's it's one of these imaginaries now. But they have sort of, after the Cold War, they sort of abandoned Latin America. So the U.S. abandoned Latin America, in many dimensions. And this, of course, opened ample possibilities. And in a certain sense, they allied with the wrong historical actors as well.
Sure. Yep.
So I'm going to take one of the questions of the audience, which actually goes very well with the question I wanted to ask as well. So we can combine them. Adam B has asked, where does the far right in Brazil get its power? For example, is it connected to the rise of evangelicalism, or are there other sort of social variables at play? And the question I had is kind of related to the far right strategy in this political moment right now, which is, as we saw in 2014, as you discussed with Aécio Neves's refusal to respect the election results, and then as we saw again in the election, in the impeachment in 2016, and again in 2023 with the invasion of Brasilia. The far right in Brazil, or even just the moderate right in Brazil, does not have very much of a compromiso with democratic institutions. But they've also been pretty quiet in that sense since Lula was elected, and that we haven't seen sort of widespread mobilizations for an impeachment of Lula, for example. So what is sort of the strategy that Brazil's right now? Are they sort of like content to let things play out and to run, try to find a consensus candidate in 2026? Or are there perhaps plots brewing right now or are they sort of cooed out after 2023?
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful question. Again, my ideas, right? I mean, this is the question in the sense, how do we, what will happen and what will make sense of things? So I provide just hopefully some ideas. I think I don't want to make always the parallel, but there's some interesting parallels in terms of the mobilization of the maybe even Christian right in Brazil, or the far right, the mobilization of the right, extreme right in Brazil more recent. I think yes, the evangelical vote. I don't want to be simplistic, and there are sectors of the evangelical vote that, including importantly, played an important role supporting Lula in the early 2000s. The vice president was a member of what was then the key evangelical party of the time. The evangelicals are represented in many different parties now, in the sense there's evangelical bancada, a caucus in Congress which is multi-party. But the evangelical demographic, in Brazil is much larger today, and it's growing, It continues to grow. Also, there's a very conservative Catholic vote in Brazil. Interestingly, of course, again, in this recent election of the Pope, we saw how the conservative Catholic vote here also mobilized for other ideas of popes. So that also, I would say 10 years ago, it was a little bit of this idea that Catholics were against evangelicals, not to revive religious wars here, but I think now it's way more complex, There is an important sector of the Catholic vote which is also very conservative. The Catholic vote, the Catholic Church has been overwhelmingly a conservative institution, especially in Latin America, in Brazil. But in the 80s, liberation theology was not at the forefront and not institutionally necessarily representing, but a kind of having a little bit, not control, but having a presence in the agenda, in the narrative of the position, of social justice in Brazil, not on other more cultural issues, but on social justice in Brazil. That has been tamed, including by actions of the Pope John Paul II and so forth. But the Catholic vote is split, and again, even if among the evangelicals, not all are necessarily supporters of the extreme right, but the largest majority are. There's these mega churches and key pastors, the media pastors, very much similar to the history of the Christian right in the United States, that have played major roles in mobilizing the evangelical vote for very conservative positions and very anti-democratic positions, This idea that if it's not our way, we're not going to accept the results of things, and we're not going to accept to participate in things. They mobilize to elect people to Congress, but if needed, such people like Malafaia, more recent, arguing and supporting that it doesn't have necessarily to be to democratic means. In addition to the evangelical, the religious cause to the strength of the conservative right, I would say that this whole neoliberal idea of entrepreneurialism, self-made man, anyone can be rich, has really, was really promoted in Brazil in the 90s under Collor and so forth, and continuing. I think now it really worked. Now, now class C, lower middle class, very much share that worldview. Last time I was in Rio, which was about 6 months ago, I walked through Galeão Airport, where there are many different important bookstores of these big chain bookstores in Brazil. And I would say 80% of the books are split into evangelical books, right? And anyone can be a millionaire, right? That kind of idea, the manual to be a millionaire. So that really has become kind of very important in the mindset of middle class, lower middle class, or potentially, aiming, aspired to be the self business person, Uberismo, right? The people, Uber riders against, labor rights in Brazil. So that part of this whole transition also of the labor situation in Brazil is part of that too. So then, Brian, you ask about, why hasn't been a mobilization for impeaching Lula now? That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have the full answer. I think they were really surprised. Bolsonaro's family, Bolsonaro closely associates, right? But how the Supreme Court took, right, the mission, right, to investigate the attempted coup and to punish them and to put people in jail. And it did. Many people are still in jail, right? And so that really demobilized them, right? Pegaram eles de calça curta, or pegaram eles on the left foot, right? Surprised them, and they haven't really been able to organize themselves. Secondly, I think the parties that would be supportive of the impeachment, right? Many of the important right-wing parties in Congress are negotiating with Lula, right? Bargaining their own interests and gains. So as long as Lula delivers on that, right, we'll work with you. We'll work with you. It's fine. I mean, once you stop that, then we'll actively, go for impeaching you. This Damocles sword, right, over Lula's hand, which kind of revised a little bit my criticism of Haddad, but in a sense. And I think that also goes into the Bancada Ruralista that we mentioned before, right? They also see that, as long as we're doing fine, we'll also go along with you. We don't like you, but we'd rather not to be you, but we can work with you as long as, right? We see this as a guy to be blackmailed for our own interests, as long as, we could consider a few things, but essentially, if you are doing fine under your rule, we can live with you in that situation. But I mean, time is moving fast, so I don't know if would still be time to push an impeachment situation now. But because Lula's approvals, of course, haven't been great, for a while now. But I don't think, it's not in the agenda at the moment. I think some are looking at the election, some are surprised and unable to respond to the investigations by the Supreme Court. Some are just looking for their own immediate interest of bargaining with Lula. But it's a great question. Yeah, I think so. It's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think thinking historically, not to plug my own research too much, but it's hard to think of any moment when there's been sort of a rupture with legality, right, and a change of Brazilian government when there wasn't the decisive support of the civilian political class, right, which is one reason why after the election in 2022, when the first thing that happened was most politicians, even on the right, didn't start saying that it was illegitimate. They started negotiating with Lula, right, because you never want to be on this, you never want to not be on the side that's in power, right?
Yep.
And so I think it's something we're seeing, right? Lula's capacity, right, for coalition building, or at least for sort of like keeping people, coming to him, as opposed to alienating people, perhaps something that Dilma wasn't quite as good at. We have a question here from Bill Summerhill from our Department of History, saying, thank you, Rafael. He has a twofold question. The first is, in the scenario of a good trade outcome between China and the US, how much downside is agro in Brazil? Agro is the only sector of the economy that exhibits sustained growth and productivity over the last 40 years. Second question, public debt in Brazil is technically unsustainable because of relentless primary deficits year over year. Extraordinarily high interest rates are the results. What political currency does Haddad require to get Congress to reduce deficit spending?
Wow. Thank you, Bill. Very nice to see that you were in the conversation. Yeah, two challenging questions, but centrally important. I alluded, to some of this. I think yes, if if the United States, as one of the slides had this idea that, of course, the United States and Brazil compete, right, in some areas for the Chinese market, not in all areas, but of course in agro primarily. And Brazil, as you said, agro has been doing so well. Maybe this sector has been doing well in Brazil only in the last several years. Brazil has deindustrialized, right, and reprimed, right, has strengthened its primary base economy, right, also including very fast under Lula, right, the first time of Lula's time in power, including in Lula's very good relations with agribusiness, right. One of his pals in Brazil politically was Maggi, right, the governor of Mato Grosso. So very complex political arrangements that we've seen here. So I think, yes, if the United States Midwest exports, right, corn and soybean and meat revives well, in these tariffs. I saw that I think the United States is lowering tariffs to 30%, right, from China, and China for US to China to 10%. So we'll see. It could, likely to impact some of the exports from Brazil. But of course, that will depend on the size of the market and the demand from in China, right? So maybe there's space for both exports. I think that has been the case now. But even though they compete, the Chinese market is so huge, right, that both countries still are able to have an important, market for their exports of soybean and meat and some of those primary goods to China, in addition to minerals and so forth. So, but I think it is, yeah. And that being the case, that could also, right, going back a little bit to the question before, that could also have political impact, right, in the support from agro for Lula, or not necessarily support, but the idea of coexisting with Lula. So again, this complex matrix of things that Lula needs to do, I think, again, brings us back to Lula being in China now, today, in the sense that he wants to, always have this good relation with Xi Jinping now, with China, in the sense I'm not sure any country would undo its own interest, right? If I can buy cheaper from the United States, or I can buy enough from the United States, I'm not necessarily going to be buying from Mato Grosso just because I like Lula. I'm not sure that's how things work. But of course, having good relations or bargaining and allowing, okay, guarantee us some market for our soybean, and we will allow you to invest in telecommunication towers in Brazil, as has been happening, right? So it is this complex set of different interests that Lula is negotiating in China now. So, but yes, it is an open new challenge for this balancing act that Lula has been doing and trying to revive and to continue to do now. On the debt, what could Haddad have as a bargaining chip for people to approve some of those things? Well, as a pacote fiscal that he was able to approve, right? This fiscal, policy or balance, the budget he was able to approve. He had to grant and to allow some gains to the more conservative the caucus or groups in power in Congress, and then so that it can achieve, reduce, at least in a future, right, in a moving line towards the next few years, under control a little bit the deficit, not reduce or address the deficit, but keep it more manageable, to cut in other areas. That's why the increase on minimum wage was lower, right, than expected, and lower than the standards that Lula was able to grant before. So I think it's this whole negotiation, and I think also that goes back to Haddad. I think he being also a more moderate, politician in his views and his style than Lula anyway, but also working as the finance minister in a more moderate or more, I don't know what the word is, Bill, you help me. Traditional standards of a finance minister in Brazil, right, for the last, from the 90s and so forth, in the sense that to be able to be accepted by Faria Lima, by the big players, the powers that be in Brazil, but also being able to negotiate things in Congress. But that is, of course, an ongoing issue. It would be wonderful, right, if it could be addressed. Of course, always going to be painfully, but if it could be addressed in the sense of lowering the interest rates, because of course that drains a lot of the possible resources, and of course interest rates in Brazil are extremely high. It's been always a historical challenge, right, as you very well know, to control, to bring them down. Even now, the new president of the central bank, Galípolo, that Lula praised so much that he would be able to do that, just to prove, right, or agree, and probably with very good reason, to increase, once again, I think it was last week's meeting of the central bank. So it is an ongoing challenge. It hasn't been as politicized more recently than it was when the discussions of the budget were taking place, I think last year. They actually changed some of the fiscal policies, right? But again, a lot of it will kick in over the next few years. So hopefully that will help. That was the hope and the attempt. But again, that will depend also on those mechanisms that are still to kick in to continue, right? I mean, the plan needs to be sustained, the course needs to be sustained, which means if someone from aligned with Bolsonaro or whatever other position in power, coming to power, government in power, that does not abide by that for whatever reason, maybe not so great, but political reasons that he need to undo just because it was done under Lula, that would present new challenges, right? Which is not exactly what we need. I would love to continue the conversation, Bill, but actually hear from you.
Actually, Bill said that one other, he said orthodox is the word that we would use.
There you go. There you go. I'm not sure that is orthodox, but maybe, yeah.
We have a question as well from Steve Scheib, who asked, a long time ago, we used to talk about dependency and development. And at the time, the concern was U.S. multinational corporations, but now Brazil is tremendously dependent upon China. Can you comment? So I don't see the development for Brazil in either case. Of course, this is the heart of your own research, so you are well equipped to comment on this question.
Well, there you go. Wonderful. Well, let's go back to Lula 1, right? Lula, even before, right, with Petrobras already in the 70s, right? Some of the dependentistas, right, like Mauro Marini talked about sub-imperialism, right? Brazil already as an incoming middle power country in the world, being able to have its own interest through its own corporations. In that time, a more state-run Petrobras player, right, in the world. Not that Petrobras played exactly the same role in the global economy as a GM, let's say, right? But it's interesting, right, that the whole dependency argument from the 70s or this more traditional idea of an impossible, right, a reframing of the South vis-a-vis the North. Of course, that conversation and that situation has evolved. But yes, you touch on a very good point, right? What is the point, not to be redundant, to moving away a dependency or a subordination, right, or hegemonic influence of the United States just to flip under the Chinese imperialism? I'm not sure that's where we are now. Clearly, that could happen, but I think Brazil thus far has attempted to leverage, right, between those, and not only, right, there are other players too in the world, but the two main ones, especially the two most important hegemonic dispute, the main hegemonic dispute in the world now between the United States and China. It's not a linear dispute. It's a complex one, many different variables and dimensions, but it is kind of the more overt one. So Brazil has been trying for a while now, leverage, right? And that hence the argument to, we want to have good relations with everybody. We don't want to have to pick. We don't want to. That has been Lula's argument for a long time. Now in a more challenging situation, because if Trump and if Xi Jinping force you have to pick a side, then what, right? What do you do? I don't think the case of Brazil is as in that situation as, let's say, countries in Southeast Asia, where Chinese leverage seems to be going in a much more path towards that. I don't think it's exactly the same thing. I don't think imperialism reproduces itself historically exactly the same way, but clearly, right? Of course, the leverage that China has exerting into key countries in many countries in the world has grown significantly. One of the aspects, right, of imperialism, or whatever you want to call the United States exerted in the Cold War and beyond, was debt. Right, one of the influences it had over developing economies was debt, and some countries in the world now, especially in Africa, have this growing debt issue with Chinese investments and so forth. So that could certainly be. I don't think Brazil. Again, that's the complexity of the global South. That is even the best label to talk about this broad group of countries where they are very different. The reality and the way to leverage between the dispute of China and the United States that Brazil has is not the same one that Paraguay will have, right? So again, this is very complex things. All of that to say that it's challenging, but Brazil has a lot of not leverage, but has a lot of tools, right? And a lot of, again, going back to the idea that Brazil sought to project an appealing image, right? Brazil has a lot more resources or capabilities, to use a more traditional policy term, right? To be able to navigate this. It's not ideal. Brazil is not necessarily going to succeed. And again, and the alignments will be different, right? You could be diplomatically more associated or more aligned with one, and economically with other. That's increasingly becoming challenging, more challenging to do. But that has been the attempt that Brazilian leaders, right, have been developing or deploying for a while now. Again, in a more challenging context. Interestingly, I'm actually surprised, and I think maybe I was just expecting and overvaluing the relevance of Brazil in the world. Brazil has not been at the forefront of Trump's interest thus far. He talked about Panama and Greenland and Canada and tariffs to the world, but he hasn't really been mad about Lula's leftist, globalist BRICS discourse narrative in the world. If that were to stay, then we'll see. Again, Lula now is in China, and again, I don't think Trump is paying attention to none of this. But if some key advisor, if Rubio picks up on that and brings it, to Trump, that could lead to some pronouncement or something new. Which means Lula should be thinking, the Itamaraty should be thinking of some sort of meeting with Trump or delegation who has to talk about its own relations with the United States, which again is very important. Brazil has not ever cut relations with the United States from the recognition over 200 years ago. Even at the time when it had some frictions in the 70s and a few other times, right? Brazil has not a strategic partnership with the United States, but a continuing good relations with the United States, functioning, of course, largely grounded on economic interest, right, in relations, but in some key moments beyond that, and trying to do those things. I mean, interestingly, when I'm not sure if that's the picture I use here. There's another picture of Bush and Lula with the Petrobras hard casket, right, where they're discussing biofuels. Bush visited Lula in Brazil in Rio. They went to the Petrobras biofuel plant. So they had this other attempt it didn't really go as far as was hoped and possibly could have gone. But the idea is that there has been attempts of establishing in some key areas, closer. Biden, surprisingly, at the beginning, promised not a lot of money for the Fundo Amazonia, but then they revised a little bit the numbers. It's still not enough from the United States at that time. But there's this flirt, right, that goes on and on. So I think that is the approach that Lula will try to sustain. Of course, the question is, again, it's two to tango, right? And we'll see how Trump administration sees that. So far, I think Lula has not been at the forefront of Trump's whims, but it could change at any moment because it is whimsical, right? So.
Just going to make a quick comment. There have been lots of cuts at the State Department, and perhaps it cut out all the people who spoke Portuguese, so they don't know what's going on. I don't know.
Entirely possible.
And I think Rubio is very tied into some key issues, right? Cuba, So I don't know. I could be surprised. I mean, of course, Rubio has been growing in relevance, right, within the administration, surprisingly so, because it was a little Rubio. Right now, it's becoming a more important, influential actor. But anyway, we'll see.
So last question.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Susanna.
No, I was.
Oh, okay. So I was just gonna the last question in the Q&A right now, unless any of our attendees want to submit another one, is from Adam B. It says, you mentioned the self-made man myth that is currently popular in Brazil. Are there other social parallels to the U.S. climate, such as the rejection of wokeism? I know I can answer one of this. Like one of the parallels in Brazil, certainly. In fact, I strongly suspect the U.S. far right got this from Brazil and Bolsonaro, was this obsession with gender ideology, right? Because like Bolsonaro's been harping on that since like 2010, long before it appeared in the United States. One of the examples that Adam gives also kind of, especially is like sort of the disconnect, I think, between sometimes like discourses among like progressive people on the left versus population at large, is the use of the term Latinx by U.S. academics, whereas polls indicate that most working class Hispanic people reject that term. Sure,
I think there are a lot of parallels. Sometimes too much, too much in the sense that they forced more than actually worked. And let me mention, yes, there is not as I mean, there's some, right? It's not trans, but at the time of Dilma, one of the things they picked on her was this alleged, right, idea that the Ministry of Education would impose throughout the schools, and the Ministry of Education is a much bigger operation, a much more powerful operation in Brazil than here, in the sense that it really organizes education throughout the country, right, in terms of the textbooks, in terms of funding, and so forth. So it's a much more powerful ministry, and that never happened. But the argument was, right, that they would have this textbooks manual to talk about sexuality, right, to kids, to elementary school kids, where, right, they would talk about different formats of family, including homosexual, led couples and families and so forth, households, and that became a huge oversized and issue, which translated into other things that they would be at the election of Bolsonaro. One of the fake news that Bolsonaro so well articulated through WhatsApp, which forced WhatsApp to review its policies to reduce the possible numbers of people you can pass, right? Replicate the message. In Brazil, you can only copy other groups of people or other people 5 times. And you have to do it again. You have to do it again. You cannot do hundreds as it was done under Bolsonaro's campaign. Some of those fake news was that Haddad, because he had been a minister of education, right? That as president now, were he to be elected, he would create this summer camps, like Nazi summer camps that all kids would be forced to go, and where some kids would be forced to change sex. I mean, it got to that level of thing. But currently, there's a little bit of that in terms of also the articulation, what I think the idea of woke, right? That people, not Latinx specifically, but people have to greet by saying "tojis," right, and those kind of things. But it really didn't get as much traction. And trans is not. I don't think. I don't live in Brazil, so on a daily basis, I'm not sure how people are talking that. My visits are, unfortunately, a little short. But I don't think it is as much traction about the whole conversation that I think you hear a little bit more here about trans and trans rights, trans sports, and athletes and so forth. I think that has it was relevant then. Another area that I think was really forced and it didn't work was the anti-foreigner, right? That Trump ran already in 2016, the Mexican invaders, right, rapists. They had tried, Bolsonaro tried to run on that even before the 2018 election. And they articulated a bit about the Haitian immigration, right, that was taking place at the time. And then they followed up a little bit with the Venezuelan, right, refugees migration in Brazil. But it never really got the traction that, of course, the immigrant, the issue of immigration in this country has had historically, has had more recently, and has now, because it's not really the culture of Brazil. I mean, both countries, of course, are countries of immigrants, but it never really got traction. When that was happening, I go to Brazil every year, and I was at I think Ipanema Beach, in the 2018 or so, and Haitian people selling things on the beaches. If anyone been to the beaches in Brazil, that have the people come and bring and sell things to you. And I talked to some Angolan, recently immigrants and Haitians, and I was like, wow. This may get traction because look, you can see a little more in the public opinion in the media, in the big cities, but it didn't amount to be this racist. I mean, racism, of course, exists in Brazil, but anti-foreign race associated idea a lot, with the exception of Haitians and Venezuelans to some point. So there are parallels. I think there are other parallels. Brian just mentioned the idea that some of these things are directly translated. Some of the narrative, the fake news and some of the manuals that happen a lot, and this happened really in the last 20 years or so. Going back to the Christian right, some of these big televangelists, right, big TV, pastors, very, very influential, very powerful, mega churches. Some of them have come to the United States for training, to speak and to, what to talk about and how to present things, which goes from oral, speaking skills to specific issues. I'm not saying that is Brazilians have agency, of course. That is not entirely the reason, but has happened too. And a lot of people is not entirely, that I know studied yet, but conversations between Eduardo Bolsonaro and Bannon, more recently, exchanging things, and of course a lot of the fake news. Were more directly cooperation and so forth. The other thing is, just to finalize, that I think has to do with woke in terms of school textbooks. That got traction, but it got traction in a very weird way, fluid way, which is the anti-Paulo Freire thing. in some of these into this pro-impeachment demonstrations, right? Some ask, of course, impeachment of Dilma, and then a military intervention and anti-Paulo Freire. When you were to ask anybody, but who was Paulo Freire and why you don't like him, most people would not know, be able to say why, right? But I think it relates to this idea that, of course, progressive school curriculum, progressive education is a challenge, it's a danger, right? And that we have to cut in that. And I think some of that was fabricated by the influence that Olavo de Carvalho had in this initial mobilization of the extreme right in Brazil, because in his writings he picks on Paulo Freire, right, as a threat, to Brazilian normal values and family traditional values and education, because of course, yes, Paulo Freire promoted a more inclusive education from the early 60s and so forth, and he paid a huge price for it, right, as this fantastic pedagogue that he was. But again, it's a very artificially created, got traction, but it didn't never really boil down to people being able to go into like school board. We don't really have that, as effectively as important as here, to talk about how textbooks are talking about the Civil War or are talking about the civil rights and specific issues. That never really got as much traction without kind of this buzzwords, buzz slogan things. I hope that provides some of the parallels, but also the differences between those two cases.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you alluded to briefly as well, but I can add a little bit too, is like the way a lot of the anti-trans discourse that is so popular in the United States right now has not caught on in Brazil, at least not in the same way. Not to set aside the fact that Brazil has very high rates of violence against gender nonconforming people. However, trans women in particular, or women who are, people who do not conform to sort of a standard two-gender binary as well, like have been a very prominent part of the Brazilian social landscape for a very long time, right? The phenomenon of the travesti, right? One of my anecdotally,
Roberta Close, right? Roberta Close in the 80s, yeah.
Exactly. One of my good friends in Brazil is a trans woman, and she tells me, she's like, what's going on in the United States? And she's very, says that in Brazil, she's never run into a problem with someone like asking her, why are you using such and such restroom? And it strikes her as a very un-Brazilian sort of situation, this kind of war on trans people.
Well, I think it's Tummy Gretchen, right? I think he keeps his name as Tummy, right? Which is a trans man now. Which used to be a sexual, anyway, sexualized whatever celebrity in the 90s. But I think he is a councilman in some city of São Paulo in a conservative party, and it's a absolutely accepted and actually important, liked guy, by the right.
I mean, let's look at Brazilian pop music, where one of the most popular singers is a drag queen, Pablo Vittar.
There we go. Yeah. I think open for Lady Gaga, no, or something.
Probably, yes. I don't know about the concert that just happened, but like,
I don't know if Susanna
Pablo
was
Vittar has like videos on
Gaga
YouTube with like 1 billion views, right? And it's very one of Brazil. Okay, can you imagine the United States where either a trans woman or a drag queen was like one of the most popular pop singers? So Brazil, yes, not all of these, not all far right boogeymen translate culturally.
Yeah, not linearly. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any further questions. Susanna, did you have any additional questions or comments you would like to add?
I do. I'm curious because of the whole role of the military in Bolsonaro's dynamics and the arrest of some of the military as a function of being in favor of the coup. I'm curious if you want to speculate on what you might imagine the role of the military might be. It has always had a kind of ambiguous role in Brazilian politics, and if it moves more to the right, what might you expect from the Brazilian military?
Wonderful question. I would say even more than ambiguous. The military has had a veto power, right, in Brazilian Republican, experience, which is beyond, the over 100 years or so. Traditionally, not always, right, not monolithically, but traditionally a conservative actor, and an overly politicized actor, right, having exerted, right, it's kind of military veto in the sense to say what goes, what doesn't go, historically, and again, it had important actually actors, right? Important, influential generals that were not necessarily to be called conservative or anti-democratic. Or
vice president.
Yeah. So, but I would say overwhelmingly, and especially Cold War-ish moving beyond, kind of became even more. Even though again the dictatorship had an interesting. That's why I didn't put exactly the 70s as in that sense, but the 70s also one of this idea of projecting and pursuing a more multilateral approach in the 70s at the height of the repression in Brazil. Brazil was Brazilian government, Geisel, starting the transition, the opening of the regime, was flirting a little bit with the agenda of the South, the non-aligned, or some of the themes of the South in terms of critique of the multilateral structure and pursuing ideas of that the global economy has to be more open to the South and so forth. Of course, continue to be a right-wing, conservative, repressive regime aligned largely with the United States, but right complexifying its agenda as a complex emerging nation would have. So there are always things to be nuanced, but yes, overwhelmingly. And Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was the glue, right? The catalytic of this different sectors, right, in society that found this way to express themselves. It goes back a little bit to what Brian said, that from the redemocratization process, the right found some moments to agglutinate around, UDR and a few other things. But the key attempts of growing a liberal party or something similar to Partido Novo, they never really found a catalytic in terms of popularity and vote, right? Until Bolsonaro, in a more consequential way. Collor, yes, right, with the neoliberal wins throughout Latin America as this new young guy, entrepreneurial spirit and everything else. But we know what happened to Collor. Eventually, he couldn't manage with the whole political system at the time. But now Bolsonaro catalyzed this disgruntled groups of people, and of course, with the key player being the military. He ran on this former military thing guy, even though to remember, right, Bolsonaro was hated by the military. He attempted to put fire, right, in a terrorist attack at the I'm not sure if it was the barracks or the academy. So he is much disliked by the powers of be in the military. But nonetheless, he catalyzed and the key generals behind him. So the key question now is, this is the first time that a general will be tried in Brazil. A few, but I would mention Neto as the key one, right? Because he ran as for the vice president under the attempted re-election of Bolsonaro. And he is. I think he's in jail, actually. And he's been tried in this big, trial that's taking place in the Supreme Court. The people speculate at least at the end of the year to have a final sentencing. So were he actually to be sentenced and were he actually to serve the sentence, right? That will be the first time. And that will consolidate or reconsolidate, right? Or be an expression of a reconsolidation of rule of law and democratic life in Brazil, or will be a reaction among the barracks, right, against that. No one knows. At the moment, we don't see a lot of noise coming out of the barracks that they would not accept that, right? But of course, I'll stop because I don't want
Who
to
knows?
something. And so,
And
no.
also the general rule, not that it can't be broken, but it's very seldom that the Brazilian military gets involved politically without feeling like they have an invitation from the civilian political elite. And if that's not forthcoming, then I think the odds the military will get directly involved go down quite a bit.
Yeah, which goes back to this idea that, of course, these key guys or the glue for the whole thing, which is the Bolsonaro family, are a little under attack. Eduardo is a self asylum right here in the United States now. So they're trying to even establish this other, kind of lines for mobilizing, right, for their cause, which is with the Trump administration. But again, Trump administration has not been very much interested in that case yet. Even though I think Eduardo Bolsonaro was at the inauguration party in Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah,
but,
he was.
but it hasn't really become anything else. But as we before this started for the broader public, things evolve on a daily basis, right? So we'll see.
If we have Rafael, do you have time to answer one more question?
Sure.
It's from one of our graduate students, Noelle Guzman. And this is an expand your expertise press beyond Brazil a little bit. It's one of the neighboring countries. So we'll see how well all of us are equipped to answer this one. But I have a slightly tangential question. How do you see the intersection between the China question and the evolving political landscape in Bolivia, particularly in light of the upcoming elections? I'm especially curious about how these dynamics might be shaped by the aftermath of the devastating fires that affected Bolivia and the countries, Bolivia and Brazil as well last year.
Wow. I have not been paying attention to Bolivia as much as during the coup, right, that removed Morales from power. I'm not sure, with the exception to say that two things, perhaps nothing specific. I think the fact that Bolivia has not been at the forefront, right, of some of these more CELAC mobilizations or acting along with Lula as much, even though Mas is still in power, right? Arce is still the president, if I'm not mistaken. Reflects some of the challenges internal. First of all, Mas is not as, I guess, coalesced as unified as before. There was this whole dispute between Arce and Morales for the ticket, right, to run now for the next election. And but Lula has been a little more. Lula's very, not aligned, but Lula and Morales met several times, and there was a moment of a little closer relation. Now Lula has been having a little more overture to Petro, right? So it's a little bit articulating other things. Boric, I would hope more with Shenbaum, but there's a little bit. They met at Salaki, they hugged, they have talked, but again, the Mexico-Brazil relation is always that one that could be, but never happens. But not as much with Arce or Bolivia. Not to say that if something like a new coup or something would happen in Bolivia, that Lula would not try to exert a positive role. But I'm not sure in terms of relations to China. I would defer to you, actually, in the sense that I assume, and I know to some extent, that of course the dependence of exports to China also play an important role in Bolivia. But the specifics on that, I think, again, it's a situation where Bolivia is not at the forefront as when it was, again, in the early of the 20th century under the first years of Morales, or second term of Morales, when Bolivia was more prominent, more projected, the economy was doing better, social programs and the political situation, even though there were attempts to remove him from power from the right, geographically on the right, and also the ideologically on the right provinces, but that didn't succeed. There was this important meeting that Bachelet and Lula did with Morales to defend, right, the democracy in Bolivia. I don't recall the year yet for now, but the beginnings, the early decade. So now things are different. I think internally things are. I'm not sure if the right has a viable guy to run against Arce, but they're trying, right, organized. And in relations to China, I would really not be able to say much. But yeah, evolving landscape.
Yeah, in fact, maybe we should have a talk, have Noelia do a talk, because her own area of research is on, well, includes at least Chinese investments in
there you go.
international investment infrastructure projects in the Bolivian Amazon. I don't see any other questions from the audience, unless Susanna wanted to jump in with any more questions or comments. I think we're probably safe to go ahead and close. Rafael, thank you so much for joining us. It's easy to see just how much sheer knowledge of Brazilian politics you have, and how effectively you're able to communicate that. So thank you for what's been a very enlightening discussion for all of us. The next event the Center for Brazilian Studies is having is actually 1 week from today, on Monday, May 19th at 12 noon. That's going to be in person here in Bunch Hall in room 10383 on the 10th floor, but there's also a Zoom component for those who are not able to attend in person. And the speaker is actually here, and I'm watching our webinar today. Pirjo Kristina Virtanen is professor of indigenous studies at University of Helsinki and is currently a Fulbright scholar at UC Davis. Her talk is going to be titled Nonlinear Time and Land Stewardship in Southwestern Amazonia. And is going to look at the ways that the temporal perspectives of the Apurina have been able to prevent large-scale deforestation in their region of the southwestern Amazon. It draws on her own ethnographic research in the southwestern Amazon. So that's going to be next Monday at 12 noon here in Bunch Hall in 10383, or also available on Zoom. For those of you who are subscribed to the Center for Brazilian Studies email list, we'll have an additional announcement about that go out in the next couple of days. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Rafael, and everybody have a great week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And Rafael, nice to see you.
Likewise.
And thank you again for this illuminating talk and your interesting insights on the questions that are raging everywhere. What are we going to do? What's happening?
It was a pleasure. I mean, the quality of the questions, just enrich the conversation, and it demonstrates against the group of people that you guys have over there. So hopefully I can come in person at some point. But once again, thank you for the opportunity.
We're going to see what we can